The first time Maeve Ashworth saw the man she would eventually marry, she wanted to dump a large double-double directly onto his very expensive-looking coat. It was late November in Halifax, the kind of afternoon where the sky goes the color of dishwater by 4 o'clock, and the wind comes straight off the harbor to remind you that you are small. Maeve had been on her feet since 5 that morning, laminating croissant dough at the bakery where she worked, and she had exactly one thing left to do before she could go home: catch a cab, because the buses were snarled, and her feet had stopped being feet somewhere around noon. She stepped to the curb, raised her arm, and a taxi swung toward her through the slush like an answered prayer. And then a man in a charcoal overcoat stepped off the sidewalk, opened the door she had flagged, and slid inside, as though the whole city had been arranged for his convenience. "Excuse me," Maeve said, and knocked on the window. "That's mine. I hailed that." The window came down a few inches. He had a clean, composed face and the unbothered expression of someone who had never once waited for anything. "I didn't see a name on it," he said. "I had my arm up. You walked past 3 empty ones. Those were going the wrong way, so take one going the wrong way and turn around, like a person who wasn't raised in a barn." That got a flicker out of him. Not quite a smile, more like surprise that anyone was still talking. "It's a snowstorm," he said. "We can share. I'll drop you first if it's on the way." "I'd rather walk into the harbor," Maeve told him, and slammed the door and walked the 25 minutes home in the sleet out of pure Nova Scotian spite, arriving with her toque frozen to her hair and her mood somewhere below sea level. She told her mother about it that night on the phone, because Colette Ashworth was the sort of woman who required a full accounting of her daughter's day. "Some rich jerk stole my cab," Maeve said, peeling off 2 pairs of socks. "Looked at me like I was a pop can he was about to recycle." "Well," her mother said, in the mild voice she used right before she said something enormous, "you'll want to be a little nicer to men in general. I've set you up with someone. Loretta's boy. Dinner Thursday, the place on Argyle." Maeve closed her eyes. Loretta was her mother's oldest friend, a woman she'd known since nursing school, and Maeve had heard about Loretta's boy for 2 solid years, successful, single, does something with a marketing firm, such a shame he never settled down. "Mom, I'm 28, I have a bakery to save up for. I do not need a matchmaking dinner like it's 1955. You need to eat a hot meal you didn't burn yourself," her mother said. "Thursday, wear the green." Maeve went, mostly to avoid 3 weeks of guilt-adjacent voicemails. She wore the green. She arrived at the restaurant on Argyle Street 8 minutes early, gave the host Loretta's name, and was walked to a table near the back where a man in a charcoal overcoat was already sitting, checking his phone. The same coat, the same clean, composed face, which was at that moment sliding through several expressions in a row: recognition, disbelief, and something that in a kinder man might have been a laugh. "You," said Maeve. "You," said Grayson Hale. Neither of them sat down for a full 10 seconds. A server hovered. Somewhere behind them a couple was celebrating something with a bottle of Prosecco, and the whole warm, candlelit room carried on, as if the floor hadn't just tilted. "My mother," Grayson said finally, "is going to be unbearable about this." "Mine's already unbearable," Maeve said and sat, because her feet still hurt and the breadbasket looked good. "Let's just eat. We'll tell them it didn't work out, which it obviously won't, and then we never have to do this again." They ordered. They argued about the cab again, and then about whether Halifax needed another parking garage, and then about whether her butter tarts recipe was better with or without raisins. He was violently anti-raisin, which she respected. And somewhere around the second course Maeve noticed she was enjoying herself, which annoyed her tremendously. Grayson Hale was arrogant and used to winning and utterly certain the world owed him a straight answer to every question. But he listened when she talked about the bakery she wanted to open, really listened, and asked her the kind of specific questions: location, startup costs, whether she'd looked at the empty storefront on Agricola, that told her he'd actually heard the dream and not just nodded through it. They did not tell their mothers it hadn't worked out. Over the next few weeks they kept ending up in the same places, some of it Loretta's doing, and some of it just the smallness of the city. And then one Friday in early December, Maeve found out exactly what kind of man Grayson Hale was, and it wasn't the kind she'd assumed. She had been seeing someone before all this. A man named Desmond had come and gone from her life. But before him there'd been a boyfriend of 2 years, a bartender named Trent, who'd taught her that charm and kindness are 2 entirely different things. Trent had a habit of turning up when he needed money, and turning cruel when he didn't get it. That Friday, he found her outside the bakery after close, and he'd been drinking, and he'd decided that the tip jar she carried home was his by some logic only he could follow. He had her by the wrist in the alley behind the shop, and she was saying no, and he was not hearing it. When a car pulled up on the street with its headlights washing over both of them, Grayson was out of the driver's seat before Maeve fully registered whose car it was. He didn't say anything clever. He just put himself between them, and when Trent shoved him, he shoved back, hard enough that Trent sat down on the frozen pavement and thought better of getting up. "Touch her again," Grayson said, very quietly, "and I will spend every dollar I have making sure you regret it. Get up. Walk away." And Trent, who was only ever brave with people smaller than him, got up and walked away. Maeve was shaking. Grayson opened the passenger door of his car, and she got in, and he fastened her seatbelt for her, because her hands wouldn't work, and then he sat behind the wheel and pressed his fist against his mouth for a second, and she realized he was more shaken than he was letting on. "Did he hurt you?" he asked. "No. You showed up." She wiped her face. "I'm okay, I don't want to go home yet. My apartment's going to feel like a place he knows. Then we won't go home yet," Grayson said. "Where do you want to go?" "Drive," she said. "Anywhere. By the water." So he drove. He drove her out along the harbor road, past the container terminal all lit up orange in the snow, and neither of them talked. And after a while Maeve stopped shaking and started, quietly, to cry. Not about Trent exactly, but about 2 years of her life, given to a man who'd have let a stranger see her mistreated in an alley without blinking. She cried it out and wiped her own face, and didn't let Grayson comfort her, because some things you have to close on your own. When they reached the little pull-off by the lighthouse, she asked him to stop. She got out into the wind and stood at the railing and shouted, out over the black water, that she was done. Done with men who took and took, done being someone's convenience. And then she felt foolish and turned around, and Grayson was leaning against the car with his hands in his pockets, not laughing at her at all. "Feel better?" he said. "Starving, actually," said Maeve, and that made him smile properly for the first time she'd seen, and they drove to a 24-hour diner in Dartmouth, where she ordered enough food for 4 people, a poutine and a club sandwich, and a slice of coconut cream pie and a hot chocolate, and Grayson watched her eat it all with an expression she couldn't read. "What?" she said, mouth full. "Nothing. I like watching you not perform," he said. "You're the only person I know who doesn't perform." She went to pay and discovered she'd left her wallet in her locker at the bakery, which was mortifying, and Grayson covered it without making a thing of it, and drove her home, and waited in the car until he saw the light go on in her window. She stood at the glass and watched his taillights turn the corner and thought, against every intention she'd started the winter with, "Oh no." They were married 8 months later on a bright day in August in a garden overlooking the Bedford Basin. Maeve wore her grandmother's dress taken in at the waist. Colette cried. Loretta cried harder and kept saying she'd known. She'd known all along, which everyone let her have. Grayson's father, Bernard, gave a toast so full of dry maritime jokes that even the caterers laughed. It was, Maeve thought that night, the happiest she had ever been, and she was not wrong to think it. She was only wrong about how long it would last untroubled. There was a reason they moved in with Grayson's parents after the wedding, and it wasn't the one Maeve's cousins whispered about. That spring, before the ceremony, Bernard had had a stroke. It was a mild one, and he recovered most of what he'd lost, but Loretta couldn't manage him alone, and Grayson wouldn't hear of putting him anywhere. So the newlyweds took the 2 rooms at the top of the old house on Tower Road and folded themselves into the rhythm of it. Bernard's physiotherapy appointments, Loretta's endless kettle, the creak of the stairs. Maeve had thought it might feel like losing her marriage before it started. Instead, she found she loved it. She loved Loretta, who taught her to make a proper fish chowder and a Scottish oatcake, and never once made her feel like a guest. She loved Bernard, who called her the baker with enormous pride and told everyone at the pharmacy that his daughter-in-law's shortbread would put them out of business. Because that was the other thing. Maeve had a plan. Grayson helped her enroll in a professional pastry program at the community college in the new year, a real one, the kind that could take her from bakery counter girl to somebody who could run her own shop. She was the oldest person in most of her classes by a few years, and she did not care. She came home every evening, smelling of vanilla and brown butter, bursting with what she'd learned, and told Grayson every detail while he lay across their bed, pretending to be tired of hearing about ganache and secretly not tired of it at all. There was a young man in her program named Desmond. She mentioned him the way you mention anyone. He was funny. He came from money and didn't need the certificate, but loved the craft anyway. He was good with sugar work in a way she envied. She said his name at dinner sometimes, because he was simply part of her day, the way Bernard's physio nurse was part of her day. She never noticed the small stillness that came over Grayson each time. She should have noticed. That was the thing she'd tell herself later, over and over. She should have noticed that her husband had stopped listening the same way. Because Grayson had a plan too, and his was going badly. There was a man at his firm named Barrett who wanted Grayson's accounts, Grayson's clients, Grayson's title, and Barrett was patient and good at meetings and better at making other people look unprepared. Grayson started staying late. Then he started staying later. Then he started coming home after Maeve was already asleep, smelling of the whiskey he'd drunk while entertaining clients he was terrified of losing. There was a colleague on his team named Odette who understood the pressure he was under, who stayed late too, who was always available with a sympathetic word and a second drink, and who had decided, somewhere in there, that Grayson Hale would be hers if his marriage could just be helped along toward the cliff. Maeve found out she was pregnant in the middle of all of this, on a gray morning in October, alone in the upstairs bathroom on Tower Road. She sat on the edge of the tub holding the test and felt joy and terror in exactly equal measure. And she wanted more than anything to run downstairs and call Grayson at the office and hear him laugh with delight. But he'd come home the night before at 1 a.m. and snapped at her for leaving the hall light on, and she'd lain awake feeling like she was married to a locked door. So she waited. She told Loretta and Bernard first, because they were there and because their faces lit up like Christmas, and she told Grayson that night, and he said, "That's wonderful," in the voice you use for a coworker's news, and went back to his laptop. She didn't understand it then. She understood it much later. What Maeve didn't know was the story Grayson had built in his own head. Brick by jealous brick out of nothing. He had convinced himself, in the small hours, worn down by exhaustion and Barrett and his own fear of never being enough, that his young, beautiful wife, who came home glowing every night, talking about a rich, handsome, talented man named Desmond, could not possibly be happy with a husband who was never there. He counted backward and forward through dates that told him nothing. He looked at his wife's joy and saw guilt. And Odette, who missed nothing, fed the fire with a soft comment here and a lingering doubt there, until one night, drunk and low, Grayson very nearly crossed a line with her that he could never have uncrossed. He got as far as her doorway, and then he stood there in the cold and thought of Maeve fastening her own seatbelt because her hands were shaking, of Maeve shouting at the harbor that she was done being someone's convenience. And he turned around and drove home and was sick with himself, and told no one, and let the poison keep working anyway. That was the winter their marriage came apart, and Maeve lived through every day of it not knowing why. She graduated top of her class. She was offered a position in the pastry department of a hotel downtown, the kind of placement people fought for. She came home glowing with it and found the house dark, and Grayson's side of the bed empty, and she sat up until he came in at midnight and told him her news, and he said, "Good for you," and turned off the light. She lay there in the dark, 7 months pregnant, and understood that she had married a man who would not turn toward her, and she did not know how to make him. There were small mercies. One night, deep in her pregnancy, she woke ravenous, the way you do, and crept downstairs so as not to wake anyone, and stood in the cold light of the open fridge eating cold clementines one after another, because there was nothing else and she didn't want to cook and wake the house. And Grayson appeared behind her in the dark, and she startled and dropped one, and he looked at her. Really looked, for the first time in weeks, and said, "Is that all you're eating?" And when she said she was fine, he got the car keys and drove her to the only place open, and bought her 2 enormous bowls of pho, and a bag of the specific salt and vinegar chips she liked, and a box of clementines the size of a hockey bag. And she sat in the passenger seat with the warm bag on her belly and thought, "He's still in there. Somewhere. He still knows what I like." For a few days after that, it was almost good again. And then Barrett scheduled a meeting, and the door locked again, and she was alone with it. The final unraveling had 3 threads, and Odette held all of them. She came to see Maeve one afternoon at the house, when the men were at work, and Loretta was at the pharmacy, and she was gracious and lovely, and she said the cruelest things in the gentlest voice. She said Grayson had told her everything. She said he was only waiting for the baby to be born before he ended things. She said, and here she watched Maeve's face very carefully, that she and Grayson had grown close, closer than colleagues, and that Maeve deserved to know. Maeve did not claw at her face, though she wanted to. She had, in fact, seen Odette's car in the driveway one early morning weeks before, seen it pull away as the sky was going gray, and she had built her own story out of that, just as surely as Grayson had built his out of Desmond, and neither story was true, and neither of them ever said a word to check. That was the whole tragedy of it. Two proud, frightened people, each one certain, each one silent. The night it broke, Grayson came home and found a text from Desmond on Maeve's phone left open on the counter. A completely innocent message about a job opening at a bakery. "You'd be perfect for it, let me know." And he read it standing in the kitchens, and something in him gave way. He didn't yell. That would almost have been easier. He picked up the phone and looked at it and said, in a flat, exhausted voice, "How long?" "How long what?" Maeve said. "Don't." And then it came out, all of it, months of it. The accusation dressed up as a question, the baby Desmond. Whether it was even his, whether any of it had ever been real. Maeve stood in the kitchen of the house, where she'd learned to make chowder, hugely pregnant, and listened to her husband tell her she was a liar and worse. And she felt something close in her chest like a door. She told him the truth, which was that she had never once looked at Desmond or anyone, that the baby was his, that she had loved him through every locked night. He wrote out divorce papers at the kitchen table that night, in his own hand, and then tore them into pieces and threw them in the bin. And she understood that he wanted to want her and couldn't get past his own story, and that was somehow worse than if he'd simply left. Their son was born on a Tuesday in February, in a snowstorm, because of course it was. Maeve named him Felix because it meant lucky, and she needed him to be. Grayson came to the hospital. He held the baby once, stiffly, and he did not choose the name, and he did not stay the night. And Maeve lay in the ward with her son on her chest and made a decision she had been circling for weeks. She had kept a journal all along. She'd started it in the pastry program, just recipes at first. And then, as the winter got darker, everything else. On the last page, weeks before, she'd written a promise to herself. If I get to the end of this book and the story is still a sad one, I'm going to stop telling it. She got to the end of the book. The story was still sad. When Felix was 1 month old, she packed 2 suitcases while the house slept, and she took her son and the money she'd saved from the hotel job. She'd been squirreling away every check, some instinct in her preparing for exactly this. And she left the house on Tower Road before dawn. She left a note for Loretta and Bernard that made her cry to write, because leaving Grayson did not mean she'd stopped loving them. She left nothing for Grayson at all. By the time he woke, she was gone, and she had been thorough. Her mother's house was empty too. Colette, who had guessed more of the truth than anyone, had already helped her find a place in another part of the province. When Grayson drove to Colette's old address and rang the bell, a stranger answered. When he asked the neighbors, they shrugged. His wife and his son had stepped out of his life as cleanly as if they'd never been in it, and he stood on the frozen sidewalk and slapped himself hard across the face, once because he'd been handed 100 chances to say the one true sentence. "I'm sorry, I was afraid. I never stopped loving you." And he'd let his pride swallow everyone. He went to the divorce hearing alone. She didn't come, because she wasn't there to fight. She was there, through her lawyer, to disappear. He signed what he had to sign and got a promotion the same month, a big one. Barrett finally beaten, the corner office his, and it meant nothing, it was ash in his mouth, because he'd spent 30-odd years trading love for winning, and had finally won, and had nothing left to spend it on. 3 months passed. Grayson took a posting in Toronto to get away from the house that still smelled like her vanilla, and he came back to Halifax, in the spring hollowed out and rich and alone. And it was Wesley, his one loyal colleague, the only man at the firm who'd never played a game with him, who cracked it open by accident, walking into Grayson's office one afternoon, with a small white box tied in twine. "You've got to try these," Wesley said. "My wife's obsessed. New place that opened up on Agricola, little bakery. The baker's incredible, everyone's talking about her." Grayson opened the box. Inside were 4 butter tarts, dark and glossy, and not a single raisin in any of them. He drove there without letting himself think about why. The shop was small and warm and perfect. Exactly the shop she'd described to him at a candlelit table 2 years before. And there was a hand-lettered sign in the window, and there was a little boy in a playpen behind the counter with dark hair, and a face that stopped Grayson's heart, and coming out from the back wiping flour off her hands was Maeve. For a long moment neither of them said anything. The bell over the door was still ringing. "That'll be $4.50 for the tarts," Maeve said finally, in a voice she kept perfectly level, because she had promised herself she would never let him see it cost her anything. "You did it," Grayson said. "You opened your shop." "I did." She rang it in. $4.50. "Please don't be like this." "I'm not being like anything," she said. "I'm working." But her hands weren't quite steady, and he saw it. And he came around the counter, slowly, the way you approach something you're afraid will bolt. "Maeve, I know what I did. I know there's no version of this where I get to be the one who's owed anything." His voice broke on it. "I built a story in my head, and I loved it more than I loved you, and it wasn't even true. None of it was true. I have spent 3 months learning exactly how much I threw away. I don't care what anyone thinks about whose son that is. He's yours, and that's enough. That's more than enough. I'll take whatever's left. Just one chance. That's all I'm asking for. One. Maeve stood very still. Behind her, from the doorway to the back room, her mother's voice came quiet and even. Colette had been there all along, sorting invoices, and she came forward now, drying her hands on her apron, and looked at her daughter with a lifetime of love in it. Give him the chance, sweetheart, Colette said. You were going to close this place and move again the second he found you, weren't you? Just to avoid this exact conversation. That tells me something. She looked at Grayson hard, taking his measure. If something's broken, you fix it. You don't throw away the whole house because one door won't close. Maeve looked at her mother and at her son in his playpen, who had pulled himself up on the bars and was watching the three of them with his father's exact dark eyes. And she felt 3 months of held breath go out of her all at once. One chance, she said. And if you ever accuse me of something instead of asking me. I'll ask, Grayson said. I'll ask you everything for the rest of my life. I swear it. He closed the shop with her that afternoon, clumsy and eager, dropping the till twice, and he buckled Felix into the car seat with hands that shook, and he drove his wife and his son back to the house on Tower Road as the light went gold over the harbor, and he did not let go of Maeve's hand at a single red light. Loretta met them at the door and burst into tears before anyone said a word. She threw her arms around Maeve and held on, as if she meant to make up 3 months in one embrace. Bernard scooped Felix up and held him at arm's length and announced to the whole street that the boy had the hale nose. God help him. And then Loretta, wiping her face, looked from Maeve to the box of butter tarts in Grayson's hands and back again, and something settled in her expression, some understanding she'd been carrying. Come inside, both of you, she said. There's something you need to see. I should have shown you months ago. I was waiting for you to come to your senses on your own, and God knows that took long enough. She sat them at the kitchen table and put a folder in front of them, and Maeve opened it, and it was a paternity report, dated the week Felix was born. I had it done, Loretta said, folding her arms, chin up, daring anyone to be angry. That baby looked like my son from the day he was born, and I was not going to let two proud fools tear a family apart over a story neither of them had the sense to check. Felix is Grayson's. It's right there in black and white. It always was. She looked at her son with a mother's particular blend of love and exasperation. You could have asked. You could have just asked her, or me, but no. Grayson had gone very pale. Maeve was crying, and she didn't try to hide it. Then Loretta slid a second envelope across the table, worn soft at the corners as if it had been carried a long way. And this came for you at the shop, Maeve. Your mother passed it to me. Read it. Then you'll both know the whole of it. It was a letter from Desmond. Maeve read it with Grayson leaning over her shoulder, and it said, in essence, that he was writing before he left the country for good, because he owed her the truth. There had been one night, months ago, after a late class and too much wine, when he'd hoped for something, and she'd been too far gone to know where she was. And he'd taken her home and put her on her own couch and left, because the whole time she'd been half asleep and murmuring. She'd only said one name over and over, and it was Grayson's. I could never have had your heart, the letter said, and I wasn't the kind of man who'd take the rest without it. I'm sorry I ever let you think I was a complication. You only ever loved him. I hope he's smart enough to know it. There was a second page, folded separately, addressed to Grayson, from one man to another. Maeve never once wavered. Whatever went wrong, it wasn't her. Don't waste the second chance you don't deserve. By the time Maeve reached the end of it, everyone at the table was crying. Loretta and Bernard and Colette and Grayson and Maeve. And for the first time in a year, they were the good kind of tears, the kind that wash something clean. Grayson lifted his son out of Bernard's arms and held him properly this time, tucked him against his chest, and pressed his face to the small dark head, and whispered that he was sorry, that he'd been a coward and a fool, that he had the whole rest of his life to make it up to him. And then he turned to Maeve and took her flower-scented hands in both of his and said the words he should have said in 100 locked rooms, plainly, without a story wrapped around them, that he loved her, that he had always loved her, that he would spend the rest of his days asking instead of assuming. They stayed on Tower Road that summer, all of them under one roof, and the shop on Agricola thrived, and Felix learned to walk in the bakery kitchen holding onto the low counters, and Grayson learned, slowly, imperfectly, the way people actually change, to come home while the light was still in the sky. There were harder conversations still to come. Forgiveness is not a single afternoon, whatever the movies say. But they had them out loud now, both of them, everyone. because they had learned the exact price of silence and neither could afford it again. Grayson deserved his share of blame, and Maeve never pretended otherwise, not even to herself. He had loved his fear more than he'd loved his wife, and he had nearly lost everything that mattered chasing things that didn't. But he had also driven through a snowstorm to sit beside a crying stranger at the harbor, and he had bought her clementines the size of a hockey bag in the middle of the night. And somewhere under all that pride was the man who'd done those things, and he came back. People do come back, sometimes, if the door is left unlocked even a crack. And if Maeve had learned anything through that long gray year, it was this. And she said it to her own daughter years later when the girl came home heartbroken over a boy. Love cannot be carried by one person alone. It is not something you win the way Grayson had tried to win, or something you endure in silence the way she had. It is built, plainly out loud, one honest sentence at a time, by two people who decide, again and again, to turn toward each other instead of away. Assume nothing. Ask everything. That, in the end, was the only recipe that had ever mattered.